My name is Jason Porter, and I didn't believe in ghosts. I never did. When my wife, Linda, and I bought our first home, I was thrilled. It was an old Victorian house with a lot of character tall windows, a grand staircase, and a charming attic that was just waiting to be turned into a storage space. But from the moment we moved in, I began to feel watched. It started innocently enough. A door left slightly ajar when we were sure we had closed it, a light flickering in the hallway when the house was otherwise quiet. I chalked it up to settling old houses make noises, right? One afternoon, while I was cleaning out the attic, I found something strange. There was a photograph wedged between the floorboards. It was black and white, old and faded, showing a family standing in front of the house. They looked happy enough, but there was something unsettling about the way they were positioned. The family stood in front of the door, but the door was slightly open, revealing something beyond the frame. A figure, barely visible, standing just inside the house. I couldn't tell who or what it was, but I had a strange feeling in my gut. I showed the photograph to Linda, and her face drained of color. She asked where I found it. When I told her it was in the attic, she seemed unsettled. "I think we should leave it alone," she said, her voice low. "We don't need to be poking around in the past." But it was too late. I couldn't shake the feeling that the photograph was trying to tell me something. The figure in the doorway haunted me, its presence like a cold breath against my neck. The following night, I woke up to the sound of someone walking upstairs. At first, I assumed it was Linda, but when I checked the bed, she was fast asleep beside me. My heart started to race as the footsteps continued, slow and deliberate. Coming from the attic, I grabbed a flashlight and made my way up to the attic. As I opened the door, the air felt thick, heavy. The room was pitch black, except for the beam of light from my flashlight. Then, I saw it. The photograph, which I had left on the workbench earlier, was now on the floor. It was facing up, but the figure in the photograph, the one I couldn't make out before, was now clear dot. It was a man. He was staring directly at me. His eyes were hollow, empty, but there was something else about his face. Something I couldn't describe. A twisted smile, a look of recognition. I backed away, stumbling over the scattered boxes in the attic. My pulse was racing. When I turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside. I pounded on the door, screaming for Linda, but there was no answer. The flashlight flickered, then went out. In the darkness, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were coming closer. I was not alone in the attic. The last thing I remember, before I blacked out, was a whisper in my ear. "Welcome home." When I woke up, I was lying on the floor of the attic, the door wide open. I didn't know how I got there. I didn't know how much time had passed. Linda was standing over me, looking terrified. "You were gone for hours," she said, her voice shaky. "We need to leave, Jason. I don't think we should be here." But it was too late. The house knew us now, and no matter how far I ran, the photograph would always be waiting. My name is Sarah Green, my husband Tom, and I had always dreamed of owning an old house in the countryside. And when we finally found one, it felt like a dream come true. The house was beautiful, an early 1900s farmhouse with ivy climbing, the stone walls, and a large grassy yard that stretched for miles. But from the first day we moved in, I had a strange feeling about the place. It was small things at first: footsteps when no one was there, the faint sound of a door creaking open at night, but I brushed it off. After all, it was an old house, and old houses make strange noises. Then, we discovered the room. It wasn't on any of the floor plans we had been given. One evening, while Tom and I were unpacking, I found a door I had never seen before. It was at the far end of the upstairs hallway, tucked away behind an old wooden wardrobe. I hadn't noticed it during the walkthrough, and neither had Tom. "Hey, Tom, did you know there's a door here?" He walked over, frowning. I didn't. We definitely didn't see this when we toured the house. We tried to open it, but the door was locked. It wasn't like any other door in the house. The wood was smooth, untouched by time, and the handle was covered in dust as if it hadn't been touched in years. I didn't think much of it at first. We'd just moved in, and maybe the previous owners had simply hidden it away. That night, I couldn't sleep. The door was on my mind, and I kept hearing the faintest sound, like scratching, coming from the other side. I woke up Tom and asked him if he'd heard it, but he just muttered something about needing more sleep. The next morning, I went back to the door, determined to figure it out. To my surprise, it was slightly ajar. My heart raced. I pushed it open, and what I saw inside made my blood run cold. The room was wrong. It was tiny, barely big enough for a single bed, but the walls were lined with mirrors, floor to ceiling, in every direction. There was no furniture, no windows, just mirrors. I stepped inside. The reflections weren't right. They were warped, twisted. My face stared back at me, but my eyes were hollow. My mouth stretched unnaturally wide, like I was screaming. I backed out of the room, heart pounding in my chest. But when I turned to close the door, it wasn't the same room anymore. The mirrors were gone. The walls were bare. The door led to a dark, empty space. I slammed the door shut, my hands shaking. I looked at Tom, who had followed me upstairs. "Did you see that?" I asked, breathless. He stared at me, confused. "What are you talking about?" "There's nothing there." The door was gone. We left the house the very next day. I don't know where it went or what happened to it, but I know this: no matter how many times I drive past that place, I can never go back. The house isn't there anymore, and I know, deep down, that it's not supposed to be. My name is Emily Foster, and when my husband and I moved into our new home, we were both excited. It was a charming house in a quiet suburban neighborhood, perfect for starting our life together. The house had character old wood floors, a creaky staircase, and a lovely fireplace that seemed to be a centerpiece of the living room. But there was one thing I couldn't shake off: the whispers. It started subtly, just faint murmurs, like people talking in the next room. At first I thought it was just the house settling. The old beams and walls were bound to make noises. But as the days went by, the whispers grew louder. One night, as I lay in bed, I could swear I heard someone calling my name, "Emily." I froze. It wasn't Tom's voice. It was soft, hushed, almost pleading. I called out to him, but he was fast asleep beside me. I got up, convinced I had imagined it. But the next night, it happened again. I woke to the unmistakable sound of whispering, coming from the walls. It was like hundreds of voices, all layered over one another, murmuring in a language I couldn't understand. The words felt urgent, frantic. "Emily." This time, I grabbed a flashlight and followed the sound, which seemed to come from behind the living room wall. I ran my hand along the cracks in the drywall, feeling the vibrations. My heart raced as the whispers grew louder, pressing in on me. The house had always seemed too perfect, too pristine. But now, I realized that there was something off about it, something I couldn't explain. I told Tom the next morning. He laughed it off, saying I was just imagining things, that the old pipes were probably acting up. But as the days passed, I couldn't ignore the increasing intensity of the whispers. They were always there, lingering just beneath the surface, calling my name. Then, one afternoon, I decided to dig deeper. I pulled up the floorboards in the living room. Beneath them, I found something unexpected: an old journal, its pages yellowed with age. It was the journal of the house's original owner, a woman named Margaret, who had lived here decades ago. As I read through the journal, I learned that Margaret had been obsessed with the house's whispers. She had written about hearing them, two voices speaking to her from within the walls. At first, she thought it was just the sound of the house settling. But over time, The voices became more insistent. She wrote that they told her things. Horrible things. They told her that the house had been built on cursed land, and that the spirits who once lived here were still trapped inside. Margaret's journal ended abruptly. The last entry simply read, "They want me to join them." That night, the whispers were louder than ever. Emily, I couldn't take it anymore. The house was no longer a home. It was a prison. A place where something dark and ancient had taken root. I packed our bags, convinced that we had to leave. The moment we stepped outside, the whisper stopped. I don't know where Margaret went after she disappeared, but I do know one thing. The house still stands, and I'm certain it's waiting for someone else to hear the whispers, but not me. Never again. My name is Mark Bennett. When my wife, Claire, and I moved into our new home, we felt like we had finally made it. The house was perfect, spacious, quiet, tucked away in a peaceful neighborhood. But then we started seeing him. It began on our third night. Claire woke me up, shaking my arm. "Mark, there's someone in the backyard." I groggily sat up, rubbing my eyes. She was staring out the window, her face pale. I followed her gaze and felt my stomach drop. A man stood at the edge of our yard, just beyond the tree line. Tall, thin, wearing a suit, his head tilted slightly to the side. Even in the darkness, I could see his grin, wide, unmoving. I rushed downstairs, grabbing the baseball bat I kept by the door. But by the time I got outside, he was gone. I told Claire it was probably a prank, maybe a lost neighbor, but that didn't explain why he came back. Every night, always standing in the same spot, always smiling. One evening, I decided to confront him. I stepped outside, heart hammering in my chest. "Hey, what the hell do you want?" He didn't respond. He didn't move. As I got closer, something about him seemed wrong. His limbs were too long, his skin too pale, his grin too wide. Then he took a step forward. I stumbled back. His smile never changed, never wavered. He stepped again, moving unnaturally, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. That was the night we called the police. They searched the yard, found nothing. "We'll patrol the area," the officer assured us. But honestly, sounds like a trick of the light. Maybe a shadow. I didn't believe him. Neither did Claire. The next night, I woke up to a sound, scratching. Not from outside, from inside. Claire was still asleep. My pulse pounded as I crept downstairs. The noise was coming from the living room. I turned the corner and stopped cold. The front door was open, and on the floor, scratched deep into the wood, were 3 words: "Let me in." We left the next morning. The house still stands, empty. But sometimes, when I drive past it at night, I swear I see him standing at the window, still smiling. My name is Daniel Reeves. My wife, Sophie, and I had just moved into our new home, a quiet, old house at the end of a cul-de-sac. It was bigger than what we needed, but we planned to start a family soon, so the extra space felt perfect. The first few nights were peaceful. Then we found the attic. The entrance was a small wooden hatch in the ceiling of the hallway. The previous owners had painted over it, almost as if they didn't want anyone to open it. That should have been our first warning. One evening, I grabbed a ladder and pushed the hatch open. A cloud of dust rained down, and the air that seeped from inside was stale, heavy. I climbed up, expecting to find nothing but old boxes and forgotten junk. Instead, in the center of the attic, covered in a thin layer of dust, sat a cradle. It was old, hand-carved from dark wood, with delicate engravings along its edges. But the strangest part, it was gently swaying. There was no breeze. I swallowed hard, stepping closer. Inside the cradle lay a small, tattered blanket, curled up as if it had once held something. I reached out. The moment my fingers brushed the wood, a whisper, low, soft, Woman's voice. Don't wake him. I stumbled back, nearly knocking over a stack of rotting boxes. My breath came in short gasps. I shined my flashlight around, but the attic was empty. I didn't tell Sophie. I convinced myself I was just tired, imagining things. That night, we woke up to the sound of creaking. A rhythmic, gentle squeaking like something being rocked back and forth. Sophie clutched my arm. Daniel, do you hear that? I did. It was coming from above us. From the attic, I grabbed a flashlight and crept into the hallway, my heart pounding. As I reached the ladder, the sound stopped, silenced. Then a soft giggle. I nearly dropped the flashlight. It wasn't a normal laugh. It was high-pitched, eerie, childlike. I slammed the attic hatch shut, hammering nails into it until I was sure it wouldn't open again. The next morning, we packed our bags and left. A week later, I looked up the house's history. In 1952, a woman had lived there with her infant son. The neighbors often heard her singing lullabies late into the night. Then one day, without warning, she stopped. When the authorities entered the house, they found the cradle in the attic, empty. The woman was never seen again. But some nights, if you stand outside that house and listen closely, you can still hear the cradle rocking. My name is James Holloway. When my Emily and I bought our first home, we were ecstatic. It was a beautiful Victorian house, slightly worn but full of charm. The previous owner had left in a hurry, abandoning several antique furnishings, an enormous floor-length mirror in the upstairs hallway. I hated that mirror from the start. There was something unsettling about it. The frame was a deep mahogany, carved with intricate patterns that twisted like vines. But it was the glass that bothered me most, slightly warped, as if the reflection inside wasn't quite right. The first time I noticed something was wrong, I had just finished brushing my teeth. As I turned off the bathroom light, I caught a glimpse of movement in the mirror, a shadow. But when I looked directly at it, there was nothing there. I shook it off as exhaustion. Moving had been stressful, and my mind was playing tricks on me, or so I thought. One night, I woke up to find Emily sitting upright in bed, staring toward the hallway. "James," she whispered. "Someone's in the house." My stomach clenched. I reached for the bedside lamp, but before I could turn it on, I heard a faint creaking sound, like footsteps on old wood. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy bookhand, crept toward the hallway. But when I turned the corner, expecting to find an intruder, there was nothing, only the mirror. But something was wrong. My reflection wasn't moving. I froze. My own face stared back at me, but it wasn't right. The expression was different. The head tilted at an unnatural angle. The lips curled into a grin I knew I hadn't made. Then, without warning, it stepped forward. Not me. My reflection. I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat. But in the real world, the mirror was still there, untouched. It was only inside the glass that he moved. I grabbed Emily's hand, and we ran. We left everything behind: our furniture, our clothes, even the house itself. The next morning I got a call from the realtor. "You left in quite a hurry," she said. "Is everything okay?" I told her about the mirror. She was silent for a long time before finally saying, "Mr. Holloway, the house has never had a mirror in the hallway." My name is Oliver Hayes. My wife, Claire, and I had been searching for a house for months before we finally found the perfect one. A charming old Victorian with bay windows, a wraparound porch, and more space than we knew what to do with. It had character, as the realtor put it, and yet, from the very first night, something felt ... off. It started when Claire pointed out something strange on the house's blueprints. "Look at this," she said, spreading the papers across the kitchen table. "This layout shows a room that doesn't exist." I leaned over, following her finger. She was right. There, between the master bedroom and the upstairs bathroom, was a space. That should have been a small extra room. But when we walked upstairs, there was no door, no window, just an uninterrupted stretch of wall. Maybe it was sealed off, I suggested, trying to be logical. Claire frowned. But why? That night, I dreamed of that missing room. In my dream, I was standing in front of the wall, my hands pressed against the peeling wallpaper. A whisper drifted from the other side, soft but urgent. "Help me." I woke with a start, my skin ice-cold. Claire stirred beside me, mumbling in her sleep. I tried to shake off the dream, but the whisper echoed in my head. The next day, curiosity got the best of me. I grabbed a flashlight and knocked along the wall. Hollow. There was definitely a space behind it. A single question burned in my mind. What was inside? By the third night, the house itself seemed to be urging me to find out. At exactly 3 a.m., a loud thud shook the walls. Then another, and another. It was coming from the missing room. Something was inside. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The next morning, I got my tools and started tearing through the plaster. Claire begged me to stop, but I had to know. With every strike of the hammer, the air grew heavier, colder. Then, as I pried away the last wooden beam, darkness gaped before me. A room, small, stifling, and in the center of it a chair, and on that chair a body, shriveled, dressed in tattered clothes, hands bound, mouth open in a silent scream. Claire screamed, and I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The police came. The body had been there for decades. A woman, long forgotten, locked away to die. But here's the thing. That night, as I lay in bed, the whisper returned. Not from the missing room, from the closet. I'm not the only one. My name is Daniel Brooks. When my wife, Sarah, and I bought our new home, we thought we had found our dream house. It was a spacious 2-story colonial with a wraparound porch, nestled at the edge of a quiet suburban neighborhood. Everything about it seemed perfect except for one thing. The house had an unfinished room. It was located at the end of the second-floor hallway, past the bedrooms. Unlike the rest of the house, which had been renovated, this room was bare, no paint on the walls, no flooring, just exposed wooden beams and a single narrow window that barely let in any light. The realtor explained that the previous owners had planned to turn it into a study, but abruptly moved before they could finish. At first, we paid little attention to it. But strange things started happening almost immediately. The first night, as I lay in bed, I heard something. A soft, rhythmic tapping like fingernails against wood. It was coming from the unfinished room, thinking it was a draft, or maybe a loose shutter. I got up to check, but the moment I stepped into the hallway, the tapping stopped. The door to the unfinished room stood slightly ajar, though I was sure we had left it closed. I pushed it open and felt a rush of cold air, though there was no vent inside. The room was empty. Over the next few days, things escalated. Doors opened and closed on their own. Sarah swore she saw movement from the corner of her eyeshadows slipping away just as she turned. At night, the tapping continued, always the same rhythm. One afternoon, I decided to inspect the room more thoroughly. I brought a flashlight and ran my hand over the wooden beams, searching for loose panels or hidden spaces. That's when I noticed something. There were deep scratches along the walls, not random marks, deliberate carvings. I stepped closer, tracing them with my fingers. Words, "Let me out." A chill ran down my spine. That night, Sarah and I decided to keep the door locked. If something was trying to get out, we weren't going to let it. But that didn't stop it. At exactly 3:12 a.m., we woke to the sound of hammering, loud, desperate pounding coming from inside the unfinished room. The door rattled violently, as if something was throwing itself against it. Sarah grabbed my arm. "Daniel, it's trying to open the door." I leaped out of bed, heart pounding. As I reached the hallway, the pounding stopped. The house fell silent. The door was still closed, but now, something was different. On the outside of the door, carved deep into the wood, was a single word: out. We left the next morning. Later, I learned that the previous owner had been a carpenter. He had sealed off that room himself, bricking up something inside before he vanished without a trace. The room was never meant to be opened, and now, whatever was in there wasn't trapped anymore. My name is Henry Lawson. When my wife, Julia, and I moved into our new home, we were thrilled. It was an old but sturdy house, built in the 1920s, with a wide front porch and a spacious backyard. The price was too good to be true, but we didn't question it. Not until we found the basement, or rather, the basement door. It was locked at first. We assumed it was just stuck, but when I tried forcing it open, I realized something strange. There was no keyhole, no handle on the inside, just a thick, heavy wooden door with iron reinforcements, as if it had been sealed shut deliberately. That night, I heard noises, soft, shuffling movements, a faint scratching, like nails dragging across wood. It was coming from behind the basement door. Probably mice, Julia muttered sleepily, but I wasn't convinced. The next day I tried calling the realtor, but she didn't answer. So I did what any rational person would do. I grabbed my tools and forced the door open. The moment the wood splintered apart, a rush of cold air hit me. It smelled damp, stale. I shined my flashlight inside. The basement was larger than I expected, stretching deep into the earth. But something was wrong. The walls were covered in symbols. Strange looping carvings etched into the stone, circling the entire room. And in the center a chair, old wooden, with leather straps, the kind you'd see in a mental asylum. I stepped forward, heart hammering. That's when I noticed the scratches. Long, deep gouges on the arms of the chair, as if someone had been restrained. They're fighting, struggling. Then I heard it, a breath, right behind me. I spun around, expecting to see Julia. There was no one there. The door slammed shut. Darkness swallowed me. I scrambled for my flashlight, my pulse pounding. Footsteps echoed in the blackness. Not mine. Slow, deliberate, then dash, whispers, double quotes. You shouldn't have opened it. My throat tightened. The air grew thick, suffocating. I clawed at the door, forcing it open, stumbling into the hallway. Julia found me shaking on the floor. We left that night. Later, I learned the truth. The previous owner had been a doctor, one who specialized in unorthodox treatments. Patients were locked in that basement. Some were never seen again, and now, whatever had been left behind was free. My name is Ethan Carter. I never believed in ghosts or haunted houses till we moved into the house on Willow Street. From the outside, it looked perfect. A two-story colonial-style home with a large front porch, a spacious backyard, and enough room for my wife, Lily, and our daughter, Emma, to finally settle down. The price was suspiciously low, but the real estate agent assured us the owners were just in a hurry to sell. Our first night was uneventful. The second night, however, was when everything changed. It started with the whispers. I was unpacking boxers in the living room when I heard its soft murmurs, like someone was standing just behind me, speaking under their breath. I turned, expecting to see Lily, but the room was empty. The whispering stopped. Shrugging it off as my imagination, I went upstairs to check on Emma. She was asleep, but the moment I stepped into her room, the baby monitor crackled with static. Then, in a voice that wasn't hers, I heard a single word: leave. A chill ran down my spine. The following days only got worse. Shadows moved where there was no light. The air felt thick, suffocating. One night, as I lay in bed, I woke to the feeling of someone or something standing over me. I couldn't see it, but I could feel its presence. Then came the dreams. Every night, I saw flashes of a woman in a long, tattered dress, her face obscured, standing at the foot of our bed. She never moved, never spoke, just watched. When I finally jolted awake, my body felt like it had been crushed under an unseen weight. Lily started experiencing things too. Objects moved on their own. The kitchen faucet turned on by itself. The house felt ... wrong. One evening, while searching the attic for more unpacked boxes, I found something that made my blood run cold. Hidden in the rafters was an old wooden box filled with photographs, black and white images of a family from decades ago. The father, the mother, and their young daughter. But in every single photo, the mother's face was scratched out. I flipped one of the photos over. Written in smeared ink were the words, "She won't let us go." That night, Emma woke up screaming. When we rushed into her room, she was pointing at the corner, eyes wide with terror. "The lady," she sobbed, "she's watching us." That was the final straw. We packed our bags and left that same night. We never returned, never looked back. Days later, I did some research on the house. The previous owners had left abruptly, just like us. Before them, another family had moved out under mysterious circumstances. And before that, a tragic event had taken place. A mother, driven mad, had drowned her own daughter in the bathtub before vanishing without a trace. Her body was never found, but I knew exactly where she was. Still there, still watching, waiting for the next family to move in. My name is Claire, and I never really thought much of my neighbors until I moved into this house. It wasn't anything special, just a simple two-story home in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where the lawns were well kept and the neighbors exchanged friendly waves. The house next to mine was occupied by a young couple, Samantha and Greg. They seemed normal at first. Nothing about them seemed out of the ordinary. They were polite, always greeting me with a smile when we crossed paths. But over time, I began to notice something strange. At night, I could hear faint whispers coming from their side of the house. At first I thought it was just the wind, or maybe some sort of sound distortion, but the whispers seemed to grow louder, more distinct. They were voices, clear as day, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was just being paranoid, but then, it started happening every night. I'd be lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, and the whispers would begin. They didn't sound like normal conversation. They were urgent, frantic, almost like they were pleading for help. One evening, I decided to investigate. I went outside and walked toward the fence that separated our properties. The whispers were louder now, almost as if they were right next to me. I stood there, listening closely, and to my horror, I realized something chilling. The voices weren't coming from inside the house. They were coming from the backyard. I turned to the fence, my heart pounding. There was a small, overgrown section of their yard, right behind the fence, hidden by thick ivy and bushes. I could barely make out a small door leading into a shed. The whispers came from that shed. I couldn't stop myself. I had to know what was going on. I quietly walked along the fence and moved toward the shed, my breath catching in my throat. The closer I got, the louder the whispers became, and now I could hear one word repeated over and over again: help. With a shaky hand, I grabbed the rusty doorknob and twisted it. The door creaked open, and the faint, musty smell of mildew hit my nose. Inside, there was nothing but old furniture, dusty boxers, and a few cobwebs. But something felt wrong. The air was thick, heavy, like something was watching me. And then, I saw it. In the corner of the shed, there was a small, old wooden chair. It was tied with thick ropes, the kind you'd use to secure heavy loads. And sitting in the chair now, strapped into it, was Greg. His eyes were wide with terror, and his mouth was taped shut. I could see his chest rise and fall with ragged breaths, but he didn't make a sound. His skin was pale, almost ghostly, and his clothes were soaked in sweat. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. What was happening? Why was he here? And why couldn't I hear him scream? Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around to find Samantha standing in the doorway. Her face was blank, emotionless. Her eyes locked onto mine, and her lips curled into a twisted smile. "It's too late," she said in a soft, almost pleasant voice. "You shouldn't have come." Before I could react, she pushed me toward the chair where Greg was sitting. The door slammed shut behind me, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic. They were all around me now, but they weren't the same whispers I'd heard before. These were screams, agonized, desperate screams, and they were coming from Greg. I tried to reach him, to pull him out of the chair, but the ropes tightened around him, as if something was holding him in place. I struggled, but my movements grew slower, heavier, as if the air was thickening with every second. "Help me," Greg finally managed to say, his voice muffled but urgent. "She's not who you think she is." But before I could understand what he meant, Samantha stepped forward, her face twisted into a horrific grin. "You'll see soon enough," she whispered. "We all will." Suddenly, I felt a sharp, burning pain in my chest. It was like someone was ripping into my very soul. I gasped for air, clutching my chest as the room around me spun. The last thing I remember before everything went black was the sound of her voice. "It's too late. You're part of it now." When I woke up, I was back in my bed. It was morning, the sun streaming through the windows. I checked my phone. It was as if nothing had happened. But when I looked outside, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Samantha and Greg's house was empty. The yard was overgrown, the windows boarded up, and the shed was gone. I don't know what happened to them, or if they were ever real, to begin with. But I know one thing for sure. The whispers haven't stopped, and now they're coming from inside my own house. My name is Daniel, and I never believed in ghosts, at least, not until I moved into this neighborhood. It was one of those quiet, picture-perfect suburban areas where everyone knows each other, and the lawns are always freshly mowed. I'd just bought a new house, and it was everything I had dreamed of. It was a bit old, but charming, with high ceilings, dark wood floors, and a large backyard. It didn't take long for me to meet my neighbors. Most of them were friendly, offering baked goods or a casual greeting as we passed each other on the street. But there was one house on the block that was different. It was the house next door in number 13, the one with the overgrown garden and the broken mailbox. The house that no one ever seemed to visit. The neighbor who lived there, Mrs. Whitaker, was an elderly woman. I'd seen her a few times in her front yard, always hunched over with a cane, tending to the flowers. She never spoke much, but I figured it was just because she was old. The few conversations we had were brief, but cordial. But things started to get strange not long after I moved in. At first it was small things, soon explained noises in the walls, like something was scraping or moving inside. I figured it was just the house settling, the pipes, or maybe rodents in the attic. But the more time passed, the stranger it became. One evening, as I sat in my living room reading, I heard a loud thump coming from the wall that separated my house from Mrs. Whitaker's. It wasn't the usual creaks and groans of an old house. This was a distinct, heavy thud, like something or someone was pounding on the wall from the other side. I stood up, feeling uneasy. I listened closely, but there was only silence, no creaking, no movement. I decided to ignore it, convincing myself it was just my imagination. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard it again, the sound of something heavy banging against the wall. The next day, I decided to go next door and check on Mrs. Whitaker. Maybe she needed help, or perhaps she was hearing the same sounds. I knocked on her door, but there was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. I tried the door handle, and to my surprise, it was unlocked. I pushed the door open, calling out for her. The house was eerily quiet. As I stepped inside, I felt a chill run down my spine. The air was thick, and it smelled musty, like something had been left unattended for too long. I called her name again, but still, there was no response. As I walked through the living room, I saw her sitting in a chair by the window, staring out into the yard. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and she didn't even seem to notice I was there. "Mrs. Whitaker," I said softly, approaching her. She didn't move. I reached out to touch her shoulder, and the moment my fingers made contact, she jerked her head around to face me. Her eyes were wide with fear, and her lips trembled as she whispered, "It's coming. It's in the walls. It's coming for us." Before I could respond, she stood up, knocking the chair over in the process. She looked frantic, like she was trying to escape something, but there was nowhere to go. "Stay away from the wall," she muttered, her voice shaking. "It's behind the wall." I tried to calm her down, but she suddenly ran toward the door, practically stumbling over her feet. I followed her outside, but she didn't stop. She kept muttering about the wall and the thing that was hiding in it. Before I could reach her, she collapsed in the yard, and I was forced to call for an ambulance. That night, I stayed awake, my eyes fixed on the wall that separated our two houses. I kept hearing the scratching noises again, but this time, they were different. They were closer, louder, almost like something was trying to break through. I finally couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a hammer and started pounding at the wall. The noises grew louder with each hit, and just as I was about to break through, something happened. The wall shifted, and I heard a voice, low, guttural, and muffled from the other side. "Get out. Get out now." I dropped the hammer, my hands shaking. I ran out of the house, slamming the door behind me. The next day I found out that Mrs. Whitaker had been taken to a care facility. They said she had been hearing things for years, but I wasn't so sure. I never went near that wall again, but every time I hear a creak or a scratch, I remember her words. I'm not sure what was behind that wall, but I know one thing for sure: it's still there, waiting. And one day, it's going to come out. My name is Sarah. I had been looking for a place of my own for months. My search led me to a modest, quiet neighborhood just on the outskirts of town. It wasn't the most glamorous spot, but it felt like home the moment I stepped foot in it. The kind of place where everyone knew each other's names, and kids played outside without fear. The house next to mine, however, always felt ... off. It was the oldest house on the block. The windows were small, the yard overgrown, and the paint was peeling. But what made it eerie wasn't its condition, it was the man who lived there. His name was Frank, and I had met him once when I moved in. He was friendly enough, but something in his eyes never seemed quite right. At first, I didn't think much of it. I was too busy unpacking and settling in. But soon, little things started to happen. I'd come home from work to find my mailbox slightly ajar, or hear strange noises at night, footsteps, scraping sounds, like someone was moving around outside. I thought it was just my imagination, or maybe the wind. But it wasn't. One evening, as I was sitting on my porch, I noticed Frank standing in his window, staring out into the street. His expression was blank, his face barely visible through the dirty glass. I waved to him, but he didn't respond. I thought it was strange, but then I brushed it off as another one of his quirks. The next few nights, I started to notice something disturbing. Every time I looked out of my own window, Frank was there, standing in the same spot, staring at my house. It wasn't just coincidence, it was too consistent. It was as if he was watching me, always just standing there in the dark. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was being paranoid, but the unease grew. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to take a walk around the block. When I passed Frank's house, I noticed the lights were all off. Everything was quiet. That's when I saw it. Through a crack in the curtains, I could make out a figure. Frank but something was wrong. His face was pressed against the glass, his eyes wide and unblinking. He was still, eerily still, like he was waiting for something. I froze in my tracks. The chill in the air made my skin crawl. I wanted to turn and run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the window. Something about the way he was standing, his posture, his eyes felt wrong, unnatural. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel the weight of his gaze on me. I felt as if he was there, just outside my window, waiting for me to move, to make a sound. The next day, I decided to confront him. I walked over to his house and knocked on the door. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. I was about to leave when I noticed the door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open. The house was dark, silent, and still. The air inside smelled stale, like no one had been there in years. But there were signs of life, scraps of food on the table, dirty dishes in the sink. I called out for Frank, but there was no response. I wandered deeper into the house, the floorboards creaking under my weight. The hallway was narrow, and the walls were covered in old photographs. I noticed something strange about them. Every single one of them was a picture of Frank standing in the exact same spot, staring out the window. That's when I heard it, a soft shuffle behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. Only the faint sound of breathing, slow and heavy, coming from the other room. I didn't wait to investigate. I bolted from the house, slamming the door behind me. I could hear him, though, his footsteps echoing in the hallway, following me, getting closer. I haven't seen Frank since that night. The house is still there, dark and abandoned, but I know he's watching me. I can feel his eyes on me even when I'm inside my own home. Sometimes, I'll glance out the window, and I'll see him just for a moment, standing there, staring at me from the darkness. And I know now, Frank is never far away. My name is Jack, and moving to a quiet suburban neighborhood was supposed to be the fresh start I needed. After a bitter divorce and years of city noise, the thought of a peaceful street with friendly neighbors was a relief. When I first saw the house, it seemed perfect, nestled between two other homes, with a small garden and a long driveway. It looked like the kind of place you could easily settle into. The first few weeks were uneventful. I met most of the neighbors. They were kind, welcoming. But there was one house that stood out, and that was the one right next to mine. It belonged to a man named Alan, a person I rarely saw. In fact, I never saw him at all. The lights in his house were always off, and his front door remained closed at all hours. I occasionally heard muffled sounds from within, but it was as if the house was frozen in time. At first I didn't think much of it. Maybe he was a night owl, or someone who worked late. But after a while, I grew more and more curious. I didn't want to be rude, but I started paying closer attention. His car was never in the driveway, yet there was always a faint light flickering behind the curtains at night. One evening, after an especially long day at work, I came home and noticed something unusual. Alan's front door was slightly ajar. It was barely noticeable, but it was enough for me to feel uneasy. I tried to ignore the nagging feeling in my gut, but something pulled me toward the door. I walked up to his porch, my footsteps hesitant and heavy. The door creaked as I pushed it open slightly. "Alan," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer. I stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath my weight. The smell of dust and stale air hit me, and I realized how quiet it was, eerily so. I could barely hear anything except the sound of my own breath. The house seemed abandoned, yet everything looked normal, almost too normal. There were no signs of disrepair, no signs that anyone had left for good. The furniture was neatly arranged, the television was on, but there was no sound coming from it. I took a few more steps into the house, wondering if something had happened to Alan. Maybe he was sick or injured. I reached the hallway, where the dim light flickered like a dying bulb. Then, I heard it. A low, guttural whisper. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but it seemed to come from deeper in the house. I called out again, but there was no response. The whisper grew louder, more distinct, and more chilling. "Get out, ... It hissed. My heart raced, and I instinctively turned toward the front door to leave, but something stopped me. A movement in the corner of my eye. I froze. There, standing just outside of the light's reach, was a figure, a shadow. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel its eyes on me. Its presence was suffocating. It was as if it was waiting for something. I took a step back, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, and the whisper came again, this time louder, more forceful. "Get out, ... now." I bolted from the house, slamming the door behind me. I ran to my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. My heart was racing, and I didn't stop until I was miles away. After that night, I never saw Alan again. The house remained empty, and the door stayed closed, just like it had been before. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me from that house. Every time I drove past it, I'd glance over, expecting to see the shadow, standing in the window. But there was never anything there. But the whispers, they never stopped. Some nights, when the wind is still and the house is quiet, I hear it. Faintly at first, like it's coming from far away, but then louder and closer. "Get out, ... And now, every time I look at my own front door, I wonder, what was Alan hiding? My name is Emily, and I've always been a sucker for small towns. When I found a house in Westbrook, a charming, quiet little place, I thought I had found the perfect escape. It wasn't too far from the city, but far enough to feel peaceful. The neighbors were friendly, mostly older couples, the kind that would wave to you as they watered their flowers or collected their mail. But then there was Mrs. Calloway. She lived directly across from me, in a house that looked a little out of place. The windows were always closed, the curtains heavy and dark, as though she was hiding from something. I had seen her only a few times, always peeking through her window, with a gaze that felt unsettling. The first time I saw her, I smiled and waved. She didn't wave back. Instead, her eyes narrowed, studying me in a way that made my skin crawl. I didn't think much of it at first. People are strange sometimes. But the more I watched her, the more I started to feel like I was being watched in return. It was subtle, just a strange sensation in the pit of my stomach when I walked near her house. But it grew stronger with time. One night, I saw her again, standing in front of her window, staring out into the dark. It was past midnight, and she was just standing there, motionless. I felt my heart race as I stared at her. There was something about her that seemed ... off. The next day I decided to visit her. I had been meaning to introduce myself to all my neighbors, and I thought it was about time. I knocked on her door, my nerves getting the better of me, as I waited for her to answer. When she opened the door, she smiled a strange, tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Yes?" she asked, her voice almost too soft. "I'm Emily. I live next door," I said. I just wanted to introduce myself and say hello. She looked at me for a long moment before nodding and stepping aside. "Come in," she said. I hesitated, but curiosity got the best of me. I stepped inside, immediately, feeling a shift in the air. The house was old, and the atmosphere was thick, like the walls themselves were holding on to something. The air smelled stale, as though it hadn't been aired out in years. "Sit," she said, gesturing to the couch. I sat down, feeling uncomfortable under her piercing gaze. She didn't offer tea or small talk like most people did when you visited. Instead, she just stared at me, her eyes unwavering. "I've seen you watching me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I froze. "What?" Her eyes twinkled with something dark. "You think I don't know? You think I don't notice?" I laughed nervously, unsure if I should leave. But before I could say anything, she reached for something on the coffee table and cracked mirror. "This is the mirror," she said softly, holding it up to my face. "It shows what you don't want to see." I tried to back away, but I couldn't move. The mirror's surface was cracked, jagged lines running through it, distorting the image of myself reflected back. But what caught my attention wasn't the mirror itself, it was the face behind me. A pale, shadowy figure stood in the reflection, its eyes glowing a sickly yellow. The figure was tall, with dark hair hanging in front of its face. It was a man, or at least it looked like one, but there was something wrong about him. He wasn't human. I turned around quickly, but the room was empty. There was no one there. I spun back to the mirror, and the figure was gone. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I had seen, but there was nothing in the reflection except for myself and Mrs. Calloway, still holding the mirror with a twisted smile on her face. "You can see him, can't you?" she whispered, her voice almost reverent. "He's been following me for years. He comes through the cracks, like all the others. You'll see him soon enough, too." My heart pounded in my chest. I didn't know what she was talking about, but I knew I had to get out of there. I stood up abruptly, nearly knocking the mirror from her hands. "I should go," I said, backing away. She just watched me, her smile never faltering. "Remember, Emily," she said softly, "he's already in your house. He's been waiting for you." I didn't wait for another word. I ran out of her house and didn't look back. For weeks after that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. It wasn't just paranoia anymore. I would catch glimpses of a shadow in the corner of my eye, or hear footsteps when no one was around, and every time I passed Mrs. Calloway's house, I would glance at the window. I never saw her again after that night, but sometimes, late at night, I catch a glimpse of a figure standing in the shadows of my own home, a face I don't recognize, and eyes that seem to know far too much about me. And the worst part, the mirror is cracked, just like she said, and I'm starting to see him too. My name is Alex, and I'm not the kind of person to believe in ghost stories. I've always prided myself on being a rational thinker, someone who dismisses the supernatural as mere fantasy. But that was before I moved into the old house on Elm Street. The house itself wasn't much to look at, a modest two-story building with peeling paint and a cracked front porch, but there was something about the paint of the neighborhood that made it seem alive. Or maybe it was just me adjusting to the change. Either way, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The neighbor next door, Mr. Hayes, was an elderly man who lived alone. I'd see him every now and then as I worked in the yard, standing at his window and staring out at me. At first I thought it was just a coincidence, but then I realized he was always there. No matter the time of day, I began to notice the strange sounds coming from his house. Late at night, I'd hear faint whispers, soft, unintelligible voices that drifted through the walls. I thought it was the wind, or perhaps the old pipes creaking, but there was something unnerving about it. The whispers sounded like they were calling my name. I mentioned it to Sarah, my girlfriend, but she didn't seem to take it seriously. She chalked it up to the house settling, or maybe my overactive imagination. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. One evening, after dinner, I decided to visit Mr. Hayes. I had been meaning to introduce myself properly, and maybe talking to him would put my mind at ease. I knocked on his door, and after a moment, he slowly answered. His wrinkled face was framed by the door, and his tired eyes seemed to study me before he spoke. "Ah, Alex, isn't it? Please, come in." I hesitated for a moment, but then stepped inside. The house was dark, the air thick with dust, and an odd smell I couldn't quite place. It was oddly quiet, and I couldn't help but notice how cold it felt. Even though the temperature outside was warm, Mr. Hayes led me to the living room, where an old rocking chair creaked by the fireplace. He sat in the chair, motioning for me to sit across from him. As we talked about the neighborhood and the weather, I noticed something strange. His eyes kept darting around the room, as if he were listening for something, and every now and then, I could hear the softest of whispers, just out of my hearing range. "Do you hear that?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Mr. Hayes stiffened, his face going pale. "What do you mean, the whispers?" "They're coming from the walls," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, in a voice barely audible, he muttered, "You shouldn't have come here, Alex." Suddenly, the room grew cold, and the whispers grew louder. They were no longer soft and indistinct. They were clear now, calling my name. My heart raced, and I stood up, ready to leave. As I moved toward the door, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Mr. Hayes was no longer sitting in the rocking chair. Instead, he was standing by the window, staring out at me. His back was hunched, his hands pressed against the glass. But his reflection in the window was different. His reflection didn't look like him at all. It was a younger version of himself, with dark, hollow eyes and an unsettling grin on his face. "Leave," the reflection whispered. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the chair. As I turned to run, the whispers grew louder, now filling the entire room. The walls seemed to close in around me, and I could feel a presence, something dark and oppressive. I bolted out of the house, slamming the door behind me. I didn't look back. The whispers stopped as soon as I left the property, but the feeling of dread lingered. To this day, I still hear those whispers, especially when I'm alone in my house, and every now and then, I catch a glimpse of Mr. Hayes, standing at his window, watching me. But it's never really him, it's something else. Something far worse. My name is Chris, and I had always believed in the simplicity of suburban life. When I bought my house on Pine Avenue, I thought I was escaping the noise and chaos of the city. The house was modest, with a neatly trimmed lawn and a quiet, peaceful atmosphere. But the peace didn't last long at first. I didn't notice anything unusual about my neighbors. They were all older, mostly retired, and kept to themselves. But there was one house, the one next to mine, that seemed different. It was always dark. No lights, no sounds, just silence. I didn't think much of it at first, just assumed it was one of those houses that people didn't use much. But then, I began to notice something strange. Every time I would go out into my yard, I felt like someone was watching me. I would look around, but no one was ever there. At night, when I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that my eyes were being drawn toward the house next door. The blinds were always closed, but I couldn't escape the nagging thought that someone was staring back at me through the darkness. One evening, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. As I passed the house next door, I saw a figure standing at the window. It was a man, or at least I assumed it was. He was tall and thin, dressed in a dark coat. He was staring at me, unmoving. His face was hidden in the shadows, but his eyes were glowing, almost unnatural in their intensity. I quickly turned away, brushing it off as just a trick of the light. But that night, as I lay in bed, I heard something footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from next door. I thought I was imagining things, but the sound was unmistakable. It sounded like someone walking back and forth, pacing. The next morning, I decided to confront the neighbor. I went next door and knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time, and still nothing. Feeling uneasy, I peered through the crack in the door. The inside of the house was completely dark, and I couldn't see anything. That evening, I noticed something different. The blinds were open just a crack, just enough for me to see the faint outline of a figure standing inside, staring out. My heart raced as I looked closer. It was him, the man I had seen the night before. But this time, I noticed something unsettling. His face was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes were completely black, void of any color. I stepped back, my blood running cold. I had no idea who this man was, but I knew something was horribly wrong. I couldn't explain it, but the air around that house felt thick, like something was pressing in on me. The next few days were even worse. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being followed. Every time I turned a corner, I felt eyes on me. I'd glance over my shoulder, and there he was standing in his window, watching me. His expression never changed, always the same cold, emotionless stare. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't. It was like he was everywhere. The whispering at night, the footsteps, the cold drafts that seemed to come from nowhere. It was all too much. One night I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I was going to find out what was going on in that house. I waited until the middle of the night, when everything was silent. I grabbed a flashlight and approached the house, my heart pounding in my chest. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the smell of decay and rot immediately hitting my nostrils. The house was cold, too cold, like it hadn't been lived in for years. I moved through the dark hallways, the beam of my flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. When I reached the living room, I froze. The man was standing there, in the center of the room. But this time, he wasn't just staring at me. He was standing perfectly still, his eyes glowing brighter than ever, almost as if they were drawing me in. I opened my mouth to speak, but no sound came out. I couldn't move, couldn't look away. And then, with a voice that sounded more like a growl than words, he whispered, "I've been waiting for you." That was the last thing I remember before everything went dark. When I woke up, I was outside, lying on the ground in front of my house. I don't know how I got there, or how much time had passed, but I knew one thing for sure: my neighbor, the watcher, was still there. To this day, I can't escape the feeling that he's always watching me, and every time I close my eyes at night, I swear I can hear his footsteps echoing through the darkness. My name is Emily, and I've always loved the idea of living in a quiet, peaceful neighborhood. When we moved into our new home on Crestwood Lane, I felt like I was finally in the perfect place to start fresh. The house was a beautiful two-story, with a white picket fence and a small garden where I could plant flowers. Everything felt like a dream, till I met my next-door neighbor, Mr. Jensen. At first glance, Mr. Jensen seemed like an ordinary man in his late 60s. He had a small, unkempt yard with a few flower beds, and he often sat on his porch, reading newspapers or enjoying the fresh air. He'd wave whenever I passed by, and we exchanged pleasantries whenever we saw each other. But something about him felt off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just a nagging feeling that crept up every time I saw him. His eyes were always too intense, like he was watching me too closely. Sometimes, he would stand there, staring, without saying a word, until I awkwardly waved and went on my way. I tried to brush it off, thinking I was just being paranoid. But then things started to get weird. It started with the windows. Every time I passed by his house, I would notice that the curtains in the windows were always drawn, except for one. The one window, right above the front door, was always wide open. I had never seen anyone go in or out of the house, and yet that window was always open, no matter the weather. One evening, as I was returning home from the store, I saw Mr. Jensen standing at the open window, staring at me. His face was expressionless, but his eyes were so intense that it made my skin crawl. I waved, and he slowly nodded in response. But this time, something was different. His posture had shifted. He no longer looked like the old man I had gotten used to seeing. His back was straight, unnaturally rigid, and his hands were curled into tight fists by his sides. That night, I heard strange sounds coming from the direction of Mr. Jensen's house, scraping noises, as if someone was dragging something heavy across the floor. The noises didn't stop, and I lay awake in bed, my mind racing with unanswered questions. I wanted to go over there to see what was happening, but a strange feeling told me I should stay away. The next morning, as I was walking out to the mailbox, I saw Mr. Jensen standing by the fence, watching me. This time, he was holding something in his hands, a small, weathered photograph. "Do you know who this is?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I leaned in to look, and my heart skipped a beat. The photo was of me taken through the window of my own home. How did you get this?" I stammered, my voice trembling. He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "I've been keeping an eye on you, Emily. You've been watching me, and now I'm watching you." I backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The smile never left his face, and his eyes gleamed with something dark, something predatory. That evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I would glance over my shoulder and see nothing, but the sensation remained, like someone was just behind me, always watching. I decided to confront Mr. Jensen. I had to know what was going on. I walked over to his house and knocked on the door. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still no answer. Just as I was about to leave, I heard something footsteps coming from inside the house. Slowly, the door creaked open, and Mr. Jensen's face appeared in the doorway. But this time, it wasn't Mr. Jensen. His face had changed. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were completely black, void of any emotion. His smile was stretched too wide, too unnatural. "You shouldn't have come here, Emily," he whispered, his voice dripping with malice. Before I could react, he stepped aside, and I could see what was behind him. His entire room, filled with photographs of me. Photos taken through the windows of my house, of my yard, of me and my family. The walls were covered in them. "Why?" I gasped, my breath catching in my throat. "Because you've always been mine," he replied, his grin growing even wider. I ran as fast as I could, not daring to look back. To this day, I don't know what he was, or how he knew so much about me. But I do know one thing: he's still out there, watching, waiting, and I will never feel safe again. My name is Peter, and my family had just moved to a new neighborhood. It was a typical suburban area with quiet streets and neat houses. My wife, Sarah, and I were eager to settle in, raise our 2 kids, and enjoy the peace that came with the new house. Everything about the place was perfect, or so we thought. The only thing that seemed unusual was the house next door. It was dark and unkempt, with overgrown weeds in the yard and cracked windows. The previous owners had moved out months ago, and no one had come to live there since. It was an eyesore compared to the other houses on the block. At first I thought nothing of it. We had enough on our plate with moving in and getting settled. But then, strange things started to happen. It started with the lights. At night, I would notice the lights in the abandoned house flickering on and off. I'd try to ignore it, thinking it was just a wiring issue or perhaps an old neighbor returning for some forgotten items. But the flickering grew more frequent, more erratic. Then, the sounds began. Footsteps in the middle of the night, heavy and deliberate, walking across the creaky floorboards of the empty house. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe an animal, but it sounded too human, too intentional. I mentioned it to Sarah, but she dismissed it as my imagination. After all, the house next door was abandoned, and the noises could be from something else entirely. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was living there. One evening, I decided to investigate. The sun had just set, and the neighborhood was quiet. I stood outside my house, staring at the dark windows of the neighboring house. I could have sworn I saw a shadow move across the curtain of the upstairs window. I hesitated for a moment, but then walked over to the house. The front door was slightly ajar, as though someone had forgotten to close it properly. I took a deep breath and pushed it open. Inside, The house was cold, musty, and covered in dust. The furniture was still in place, as if the owners had simply walked out and never returned. But the strangest part was the silence. There was no sound, no creaks of settling wood, no hum of an old refrigerator. It was unnervingly still. I moved through the rooms, the floorboards creaking under my weight. As I reached the staircase, I heard it again, the footsteps, louder this time, coming from upstairs. My heart raced. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" But the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. I took a step toward the stairs. But before I could move any further, the front door slammed shut behind me, locking me inside. I tried to pull the door open, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as I realized I was trapped. Then, from the shadows at the top of the stairs, a figure appeared. It was a man, but his face was obscured by shadows. His posture was stiff, almost unnatural, and his arms hung limply by his sides. His eyes were wide, and his mouth was stretched into a twisted grin. "Welcome home," he whispered, his voice raspy and cold. I tried to run, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. The man's grin grew wider, and I could feel his gaze piercing through me, as though he were seeing into my very soul. Just as he took a step forward, the door to the house burst open, and I found myself back outside. I was gasping for breath, heart pounding, sweat dripping down my face. I turned to look at the house, but it was dark and silent once more. The front door was closed, and everything seemed normal again. But I knew what I had seen. The house next door was never empty. It had been waiting for me. My name is Rachel, and I've always been the type to keep to myself. When my husband, Mike, and I bought our new house, I was excited to start fresh in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The house was beautiful and old Victorian, with big windows, a wraparound porch, and a garden that had potential. But there was one thing I hadn't anticipated. Our neighbor, Mrs. Green, lived next door. She was a frail woman, always wearing old-fashioned dresses and a brooch that looked like something from the 1940s. Her house was well kept, but there was something about it that seemed off. The windows were always closed, no matter the weather, and she rarely left her house. At first I didn't think much of it. Every neighborhood has its peculiar resident, right? But it wasn't long before I noticed her watching us. It started with glances through the window. I'd catch her standing by the curtains, her eyes locked on our front door. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. But the more I noticed, the more unsettling it became. One afternoon, I was in the backyard watering the plants when I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I turned around and saw Mrs. Green standing at the edge of her yard, staring at me. Her eyes were wide, her expression unreadable. She didn't wave or speak. She just stood there, watching. I felt an uneasy chill run through me, but I shrugged it off. Maybe she was just lonely. The next day I went out to grab the mail. As I stepped onto the porch, I noticed something strange. A small, neatly wrapped package had been left on our doorstep. It was addressed to us, but there was no return address. I hesitated, but curiosity got the best of me. I opened the package, and inside was a porcelain doll. It was old, with glass eyes that seemed to follow me, no matter where I moved. The note attached simply read, "Keep her close." My heart pounded in my chest as I looked over at Mrs. Green's house. Through the window, I could see her standing there, watching me again. I didn't know what to do. My instinct was to take the doll inside and burn it, but I couldn't bring myself to touch it. Something about it felt wrong. Over the next few weeks, things escalated. I started finding more strange gifts on our doorstep: an antique key, a torn piece of lace, an old photograph of a man I didn't recognize. Every time I looked outside, I'd see Mrs. Green standing by her window. Watching it wasn't long before I began to feel like I was losing my mind. I started having nightmares of Mrs. Green standing at the foot of my bed, her cold eyes staring into mine. In the dreams, she would always whisper, "You're mine now." One night, after another restless sleep, I decided to confront her. I marched over to her house, my heart pounding in my chest. When I knocked on the door, there was no answer, but I could hear someone moving inside. I tried the handle. It was unlocked. Inside, the house was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of old wood. As I moved deeper into the house, I saw the walls were covered in photographs of me and Mike, our house, our backyard. But the strangest part was the way the photographs were arranged. Each one had a red X drawn over it. I turned a corner and found Mrs. Green standing in the hallway. Her eyes were wide, her lips twisted into a grin that sent a wave of nausea through me. "You shouldn't have come here," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "Now, you're part of the collection." Before I could react, the door slammed shut behind me, and the lights flickered out. I'm not sure how I got out of there, but I left the house without looking back. Mrs. Green is still next door, watching, and I've come to realize that some neighbors are better left unseen